Dr. Sato first discovered BFR, calling it Katsu training, in 1966. Nick, can you explain what exactly blood flow restriction training is and also what personally got you interested in it?
Yeah, Dr. Sato, it's like this mythical story. I have no idea if it's truly accurate or not. I think the truth is probably, some form of that story, but generally, katsu in Japanese means added pressure, and basically, their philosophy is slightly different than the philosophy of Western-based blood flow restriction. I think that's an important philosophical, uh, stratification there, or like guide, because in Eastern-based applications like Katsu, they are aiming for venous restriction and arterial inflow that is not meaningfully perturbed. Versus Western-based applications are more about venous occlusion, so preventing blood flow from coming back to the heart from the periphery, and about arterial restriction. And as such, the pressure application guidelines for each of those tend to differ. And I got into blood flow restriction, or at the time, occlusion training back. I first found out about it when I was in Washington, D.C., doing my master's, and I saw a bodybuilder who had these straps around his arms, and his arms were basically purple. And I, in that time, was actively competing as an amateur bodybuilder. And so, of course, in the bodybuilding community, there's the idea that you do anything for gains. I think that's manifesting right now in our area, right, where we're talking about lengthened partials and full range, things like that. So for me, of course, I was genuinely curious, and so I approached him, and much like the average bodybuilder, he was like, "This is occlusion training, bro," and he was like, "Yeah, you get a max pump, and you can, get muscle." And I was like, "Okay, sign me up, I'm in." But at that time, there really weren't any sort of good alternatives to the wrist, to the, like, the straps. And so I picked it up for a little bit and then put it down, because while it did feel good, and I think, if you are a bodybuilder looking to maximize your physique, you really want to chase that feeling of burn. And that's kind of where some of the BFR has gained popularity in the bodybuilding community. Not to mention the fact that you can use it in a deload period, or even to treat some issues, which is really cool from a physical therapist perspective. But yeah, so I picked it up, put it down, didn't really think anything of it until about my first or second year in PT school. I saw in short succession, I saw this video about on Dwight Howard, which is an NBA player, and he was profiled on ESPN, and they were looking at his blood flow restriction training routine and how it helped deload his body so it preserved his knee function. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And then in some point in that near area, I picked up an article by Jeremy Lenicky out in Ole Miss, and read it, and I was like, wow, there actually it could be some legs to these things, because now I had much more experience in strength and conditioning. I interned as a strength coach as part of my master's, and I felt that this had a lot more legs. And so I, type A personality, and it's still enthusiast for building muscle. I think that's one of the pleasures in life, is going after something. And I will say this to anyone listening, they probably understand that there are a few things, and this is a diatribe tangent, but there are a few things in life where if you put effort in, you're guaranteed to get results out. And lifting is one of them. If you train really hard, your body will respond. It's literally biology. Anyways, I dove right in and I tried to voraciously read as many articles as I possibly could, and I used social media to keep me accountable. In the early stages of social media, this is probably back now over 9 years ago. I would read a research paper, I'd make a short infographic about it, and then I'd post it up to the ether. And it's funny because I would get so trolled. Why would you use BFR? What is stupid? You need heavy weights in order to grow muscle. And this was in the time where, where rep ranges were really, a thing. And then you had this strength endurance continuum. And so BFR kind of didn't really fit into that model. And it's funny now, basically, I don't really ever get trolled on BFR anymore because I think it's firmly solidified in, its application. But yeah, I use social media to kind of, keep myself accountable, grow, and then opportunities presented itself. And then here we are, 9 years later. And yeah, it's been a journey.
Really cool to hear about, yeah, how you first discovered it. I know, I don't know, I imagine you discovered it before. I mean, I'm not even sure when I discovered it, but it must be close to a decade ago that I first came across it. And I think it was like Lane Norton was using it potentially, maybe even wrote an article on it. And I was using knee wraps for like wrapping my thighs, and I was using medical tourniquets for my arms. They really didn't really work super well, and that kind of side of things has really improved in terms of the application of tools that we have available now. There's several companies that have like ones that cost several $100s to be able to use, so that's kind of really interesting. Also, I didn't know, actually, on my research on you, Nick, I did notice, I think I saw a stage shot, but you don't have too many. Was it, what category were you competing in?
Men's physique. I I ended up retiring on top. This small Muscle Mania show that I won. I think there were 8 competitors, but yeah, I mean, I kind of stopped competing for a number of reasons, but for the sole thing of when I was competing in NPC, and I was what I thought was in pretty good shape, conditioning wise, and even size wise. I mean, I'm 6 feet. I was 195 walking on stage, and natural. And the guys that I was on stage with, some of them were bigger and leaner than me. And I was just like, and this is two different shows. And I was still like amazed because, and that was really the first foray into like the true impact that anabolics can have on your physique. Because, you look at the natural bodybuilders like Eric Helms, you have seen your physique, and really when you diet down, you get leaner. Like it just is what it is. And you see some of these IFBB pros and they're lean and huge. And so it's just like, it was just a awakening for me of like, listen, like I've worked with individuals that are on anabolics. I have no qualms with what they're doing. They're going after what they want to go after. It just wasn't for me. And so that's really, where I kind of stopped competing, because there was just going through the prep, going through, the whole thing of like, you're sore, you're tired, you're fatigued, you're irritable, the whole contest prep. To just do that and then show up and then basically get blown out. was not encouraging for me. But I'm happy I did it, and I kind of, understand the demands of the sport. And then since then, that's kind of given me some cred to be able to be involved in bodybuilding in just more than uh, bystander. I've been able to contribute to the NASM's bodybuilding and physique coaching certification. Did a rehab and warming up chapter on that, but yeah, it's been fun, and I do love bodybuilding, especially now, taking it for granted all these years. I've been slowly getting back to it because I've unfortunately had long COVID for almost 2 years, and
Wow.
now I'm finally getting back into the gym, and that itch, that itch, of where it's just fun moving, and I was strong, and it's nice to know that I still got it at 37. So
That muscle memory definitely kicks back in, which is great.
it's a real thing. I mean, you
Yeah.
you you don't lose those satellite cells, and that's the whole thing about the anabolics, right? Is you can go on a cycle, and those satellite cells are still with you. So even if you go off cycle, your growth potential has now increased. And that's that whole thing about, natural shows. I mean, you could still go on a cycle and and come out and still test clean, but have that machinery that increases your potential for success.
Yeah, I don't know how much you keep up with it. Not that I won't make it into that sort of show, but the IFBB introduced their like natural league, and I actually
Oh, really?
forget what their drug-free policy is, but I think it's something along the lines of 4 years. It's vastly shorter compared to, say, the WNBF, which you could argue is the biggest,
Mhm.
most popular natural bodybuilding federation, who has a 10-year drug-free policy. And it's just like, I mean, after 10 years, I don't know what things are looking like, but
Yeah.
most people who have blasted gear probably aren't looking to compete in natural bodybuilding. But maybe 4 years, I don't know. That's a substantially lower time period, but I think when you accept doing it naturally, I think you accept a lot of things of just like, hey, there's so many things out of my control. I just do this for myself, even if I go
You do it for
personally
the love
turn.
of you do it for the
Yeah,
love of the grind. I mean, and
exactly.
that's really where I I have a ton of appreciation for, weight type sports, because it requires significant determination constantly. It's not like oh, I'm gonna like kind of dabble here and dabble there. It's a lifestyle choice. And
Yeah.
it's something that you do, not for a day, not for a week, not for a month. You're talking years. If you want to be successful. I mean, again, people recreationally, that's great. I'm usually fall into the camp of, if I'm gonna pick something up, I'm not gonna be, a schlup about it, which is why, it still kind of stings with the bodybuilding, right? Like, it is what it is.
I think if I had entered a untested show the first time I competed back in 2014, looking the way I did, I think I probably would have completely thrown in the towel as well, because I didn't even look competitive, particularly on a natural stage as a novice, let alone kind of against the big boys. I can't imagine. But back then, I don't know how. When I competed, Matt Ogus was like, and 3DMJ were getting popular on YouTube. So I guess maybe you competed a bit earlier than 2014. What year was it that you competed?
It was in 20, because it was in DC in that period, so 2012 to 2014.
Okay. So maybe natural bodybuilding, I think it just hadn't quite picked up
Nah,
momentum.
it wa
No.
it really started to pick up steam a little bit after I stopped.
Yeah. To bring it back to blood flow restriction training, so it's clearly hypertrophic, and like you said, it's very much accepted now. Do we know the mechanisms that is leading to it? Is it different to just your general resistance training? Is there anything special going on?
Mm, In terms of muscle growth, I don't think so. I think when we look at the existing body of research, there's a number of ways that I kind of contextualize where BFR fits. When we think about hypertrophy, um, we know, or we think we know, that mechanical tension is the primary driver of muscle growth. And I think there was a lot of confusion in the initial parts of, when BFR was kicking up, because people were confused that you can have this tool that promotes um, metabolic stress, increases in hydrogen and lactate, that could stimulate similar growth as high load exercise. And so the research that's kind of come out has said, all right, well, we know longitudinally that if you work out with BFR using light loads, which is typically how it's prescribed, then we can expect similar muscle growth as if we were lifting heavy. Now, my bias is such that mechanical tension is probably the only driver of muscle growth. And my thought is framed a number of a number of different things. Number one, we've had studies that, well, first and foremost, number one, when you look at the molecular milieu associated with an end stage resistance exercise with BFR compared to high load exercise, it's identical. And there have been actually, a group out in, I believe, in Germany, Alexander Franz. He has looked at kind of his group has looked, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm pretty sure I am, but his group has looked at kind of the end metabolic stress and just different ways to look at whether high load exercise induces a different effect as low load exercise or blood flow restriction. And they basically walked away saying it's identical. So we have the molecular milieu that are identical at task failure. We have the longitudinal data that show similar muscle growth, at least, again, and this is the caveat here, in the short to moderate term, right? Research is done in a snapshot of a long-term training program. Do I believe that, and this is a caveat, do I believe that using blood flow restriction in the long run is going to not outperform or promote equivocal muscle growth as high load exercise? Probably not. And we can talk about that if that's possible. I think that we're getting a lot of benefit of BFR, but nothing is going to beat high load exercise. In pound for pound, it's just not going to happen. But we have that, right? So mechanical tension, okay. When we think about metabolic stress, you look and you can see that in most studies, metabolic stress at task failure is similar or greater in blood flow restriction than other exercises. Yet we still see identical growth. Dr. Lenike's group has trapped metabolites after high load exercise, and showed no additive benefit to trapping metabolites. Because remember, if metabolites, which compose the metabolic stress aspect, are anabolic, then trapping those metabolites should theoretically increase the benefit of muscle growth long term. We don't see that. Cell swelling, the pump, I love the pump. I think it's amazing. I teach, actually, I have an education company, the BFR Pros. We do online and in-person education, and our slogan is #chase the pump. And it's not that the pump itself is anabolic. We have evidence that shows that just giving your muscle cell a pump actually maybe at best anti-catabolic, but is certainly not anabolic. And we see that through BFR. Again, when you look at longitudinal evidence and you kind of see that they're similar, but BFR might have a greater pump, greater metabolic stress. It kind of discounts the importance of those as mechanisms for muscle growth. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I kind of think that if you frame it in that way, and then if you look at mechanical tension, it's mechanical tension at the single fiber level, right? And so abstractly, if we're moving slow with high muscle activation, those muscle fibers are going to be experiencing a lot of tension and thus grow. When we go to volitional failure, we tend to see that the slowing down, whether it's at the end, like with low load exercise and blood flow restriction, or throughout the exercise, like in high load exercise, we tend to see similar velocities at task failure, right? So again, it goes back to what are the things that we can link to that might be unique to blood flow restriction compared to high load exercise. And when we think about it in regards to hypertrophy, the proof is in the pudding. And right now, the research at large just says that BFR probably operates in whatever the mechanism is, probably similar to high load exercise, given the longitudinal outcomes are identical. And this is like the thought experiment that I usually have, that I had in my head. It's like, okay, we have all these different mechanisms that are supposedly working. Yet when we look at different conditions and we see identical muscle growth, how likely is it that all these different mechanisms somehow add up to the same, percentage growth in a training program? And that's kind of where my bias comes in, of like, maybe it's a little bit simpler than that. Obviously, there's complexity associated with human anatomy and biology. But that's just, kind of how I think about it in that context of muscle growth, at least.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And from everything I've read and seen, it does seem like mechanical tension is the kind of key driver for growth. Or I think actually maybe Brad Schoenfeld recently phrased it as mechanical stress as opposed to tension, because tension makes people think of just like, hey, load, it has to be heavy. And it's like, well, actually, you can go pretty high in reps. Although to your point, like you said, BFR has only been studied so long and seen growth for those periods, so we don't know what happens after that. I think you could say the same for like higher reps, though bodybuilders worldwide have probably been doing it themselves on their own experimenting and growing well. But I often forget that with people talk about that 5 to 30 rep range. And I'm like, but those high reps actually haven't been studied for extensive long time. I actually don't know if it's true for the low reps, but I'm kind of going down a different route there. But I think the metabolites and, like you said, that metabolic stress, that cell swelling, in terms of mechanisms, they sound really kind of like almost intuitive when you get it spoken out to you, like, hey, this like lactate builds up and it causes this like hypertrophic cascade, or the volume sensors in the muscle and it senses the swelling. And I really enjoyed it when Brad first released his paper and he talked about it. I was like, oh, I need to do more like muscle swelling work within my training. But it's nice that it's kind of come back to being maybe a little bit more simple. And it's like there's many roads to, essentially, you could quote unquote say like hard sets in effect. That seems to be what that occlusion is doing. It's just allowing you to use lower loads and get to those, make it hard sooner versus later. There was something, you mentioned satellite cells earlier. I think there was a little bit of research looking at potentially an avenue where satellite cell response to the BFR could like augment longer term hypertrophic adaptations. I don't know if you've got any opinions or thoughts on that further.
Yeah, I don't think it's relevant. Why? Because the studies that have looked at that have used, and this is again, I listen to a lot of podcasts on blood flow restriction. Why? Because I want to know what other people who are considered experts are saying about BFR. And a lot of the time, I want to bring my head out. So, in regards to the satellite cell phenomena, if you look at the Nielsen paper, which is really where the notion that BFR can create this satellite cell response. If you look at the fine details of the study, they work matched the exercise. So they had the BFR group exercise to volitional failure, and then they took the other leg, and then they had that person do to work match. So if you went to failure of 50 reps, then they had the 50 reps done on the other leg. Now, we all know then that BFR accelerates accelerates fatigue, muscular fatigue. So that, of course, the proximity to failure is going to be vastly different, not only from, a group level, but an individual level, right? So, there needs to be more, and this is kind of where, when you look at some of these studies that have actually analyzed BFR to volitional failure, which is what I think is the most important thing to do when we think about understanding the mechanisms of BFR, because at least you're standardizing the effort level, right? And then you can get into ways that we can potentially lessen the overall demand, like, and that's a cuff thing potentially. But overall, we tend to see similar responses to high load exercise and low load exercise with BFR from a potentially a capillarization, especially if it's taken to volitional failure, from a type 2 response. There is some evidence that says that maybe there might be a preferential type 1, fiber hypertrophy. I was involved in that paper with Brad, but uh, again, I have doubts. It's like, for example, some of the studies, when you have a high frequency type program, meaning that when you're training 1 to 2 times a day, multiple times per week, typically it's classified, at least in one of the papers that we publish, we classified high frequency as anything greater than 4 sessions per week. What ends up happening is, and this is kind of gets into some of the fatigue literature and what that does to muscle fiber recruitment. But if you're consistently exercising to volitional failure, you're going to accumulate muscle damage. Muscle damage is going to inhibit top end motor unit recruitment. So my idea with how I model that kind of response is that when you include a lot of studies that have this high frequency component, and it could be more than 4 sessions a week, or it even could be in unaccustomed people, right? Like, no, not really trained, even 3 times a week might even be too much, right? Might not even give them the recovery period that they need in order to actually, continue to stimulate those high threshold motor units. And so what happens is that they reach fatigue, but they reach fatigue without stimulating those high threshold motor units. And now, instead of looking at it like, if this is the whole continuum of motor units, and we get this exponential curve where we have the top end of the motor unit pool on this side, well, now you can't access that. So now the muscle fibers that are recruited are here. Guess what? Guess what type of muscle fibers are predominantly, there? Type 1 fibers. So now the type 1 fibers are more recruited and more stimulated, and thus could potentially, grow to a greater capacity in that regard. And again, then I know the bodybuilders then that were watching this would be like, all right, well, that's good, right? We can hypertrophy more our type 1 fibers. But I don't know. I think that, there's that inverse relationship between the amount of capillarization and growth potential of these fibers. So at some point, it might not even it might not matter. And so that's where, it kind of can get into the fun stuff with BFR. But I always try to take a step back and try to use common sense instead of trying to throw a mechanism or something crazy out in the wind. Even though I guess I just did throw something out in the wind. But yeah, I try to like make sense of it as much as possible to kind of give common sense recommendations on how you're actually going to be implementing it, because I do think BFR is extremely good at what it does. But I don't think that it is something that is like, I don't think that if you can do higher, if you can do even moderate load exercise, I would do moderate load exercise over blood flow restriction. But that's just based on my understanding of exercise science and physiology, and understanding that BFR is not comfortable, right? And I publish on that, and it's really not. It's something that can limit adherence. Same thing like what you said before about high rep ranges. Sure, the rep ranges might be in the short to medium term provide equivocal growth, but how demotivating is it when you're going to have to do like a 30 rep set? Like at some point the adherence goes like this and you're like, I'm good, and then move on.
Yeah, I think if no one's tried occlusion or BFR training, they've probably done leg extensions and relatively high rep leg extensions. You get kind of a bit of an occlusion effect, and you get that build up of the burn, the cell swelling. And the number of clients where I've watched their leg extension, I'm like, man, you probably had 5 more left. They're like, seriously, I have to push through
Yep.
like that burn discomfort. And like, that's BFR every set. I
Yeah, and
dealt with a
the
few.
set really starts there. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't, I can't remember where I heard it from, but really, like, if you're not creating a significant anaerobic demand on your muscle tissue, you are not going to grow optimally. You might grow a little. Why? Because you're still stimulating some of those, low to moderate threshold, motor units, but you're really not gonna get that exponential recruitment, because that's really what you're going to need to get that growth.
yeah, it's like normal traditional weight training. You get like a bit of burn and discomfort, and especially as you go higher in reps. But really, it's just, hey, it takes more effort to continue to get reps, and your rep speed slows down. You get exactly that with BFR, but with all that pain and discomfort. Because I was just gonna say,
It's a serious consideration,
yeah,
and that is, as a physical therapist, something that I always consider is patient comfort, and how we can maximize patient comfort while also maximizing, potential therapeutic outcomes. And I don't BFR is just one of those things that the way that I teach it is like, you got 3 different types of people. You got the masochists, which is the people that are probably listening to this or watching this podcast, which are, or people that love the burn. They are chasing it. They are the people that, you probably, like the bodybuilder that I gave the example of earlier. Limb is purple. That's not how it should be. That more pressure is necessarily better. That's not something that I would agree with. And if you even think about it, it probably inhibit your overall growth too, because it's more and more uncomfortable. Then you got the quitters on the other side. These are the people that are like, any sort of metabolic stress, kind of like the example you gave, are like, oh, should we really start? You got to really handle those with handle them with kid gloves. And you have to say, all right, here's why. And then you got the battlers. Those are like the 75% of the people that, will go through it, will do it. But again, considering application, considering prescription, things like that to maximize long-term adherence is going to be critical. And that's where, my academic interest in understanding the ways in which BFR is applied, both in terms of, like, you mentioned continuous BFR earlier, of like the cuff is on throughout the exercise, but also what about, the ways in which we can potentially manipulate the pressure, whether it's during exercise, whether it's actually taking, the cuff pressure off during the rest period, right? There is rationale that still will have a benefit, but also maximize the comfort. to the device features, right? We talk about, you mentioned that there's a tourniquet, right? But not all cuffs are actually tourniquets, right? They're designed a different way. And so my interests are deconstructing the marketing from the actual science so we can come up with common sense, practical recommendations for implementation.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up.
Yeah, I love that. And like I said, I've had a bit of foray with BFR, and last year had a pretty nagging leg injury, which ended up being the best I could do was BFR for a number of weeks. So all my quad training was basically BFR, and it was just horrendous. The quads might be the worst place to use it. And there was actually this, I read up on one of the papers that you were on, there was this interesting case report of a 22-year-old bodybuilder in their contest prep 2 weeks out. They needed knee surgery, or were told they needed knee surgery, and they wanted to delay it to compete. They competed, finished top 5, used BFR, didn't see any kind of loss of muscle. And they also found that after that, they ended up not needing surgery. They could go for non-surgical interventions. So I'd love to know, kind of similar to that, and you talked about it, like there may be therapeutic benefits to using BFR as well. What kind of, for bodybuilders listening, what are ways that you would consider, like, hey, this is a good time to consider using BFR? You also mentioned deloads.
Yeah, well, I wasn't on that paper, but that was Dr. Lenicky back in Practical BFR, and basically this guy was staring at surgery and did not want that, and so he used Practical BFR to help, and they saw some healing, and basically just didn't have surgery. Which, to be honest, that case report is a perfect illustration of how to use blood flow restriction. He was in contest prep. He was load compromised and pain compromised. So the way that I think about BFR is through this, overall like screening process of which to be able to use BFR for at least patients, they have to be load compromised or pain compromised or both. And that kind of gets them into the funnel. With bodybuilders, they're not necessarily load compromised, but they certainly could have some pain, right? And pain is an accepted part of bodybuilding culture. And competitive bodybuilders do have, musculoskeletal issues. We published in Strength and Conditioning Journal looking at some of the incidents of injury reports and then how to train around injury. I did that with Nick Licamelli, also another physical therapist, and Jeremy Lennick, actually. But yeah, deloads, easy. What you're trying to do is you're trying to continue to stimulate the muscle protein synthesis, anabolic processes, in order to continue to grow, even in periods where you might want to give your joints a rest. That is such an easy application for it. Other applications that are really cool. Say you have an achy elbow, say you have an achy knee. What we understand about BFR is it can upregulate endogenous opioids and downregulate our sensations of pain. I use this very, very frequently, not only with myself when I had issues, but also with clients and patients. And we do have evidence to support that functional task performance after use of blood flow restriction improves in individuals with anterior knee pain. That was Dr. Korkakis's research. And so it really does like have a meaningful impact. So how would you do that practically? Well, we understand that there is this relationship between the amount of applied pressure, the discomfort, and thus the overall kind of feelings of or hypalgesia. And so if you're going to use this prior to, say, you have an achy knee, like you said, part of what I would do for someone like you that would be transitioning back to moderate to high intensity exercise would be, I would continue with your programming with whatever you're doing with BFR, right? And then after that, give yourself a 5 to 7 minute break. And then I want you to try to load moderate to high high intensities. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give a little temporary window to then be able to get you back to what I feel is optimal, which is high load exercise, both from a neuromusculoskeletal perspective, but also from just a cognitive, like it's a lot more tolerable to be able to be like, all right, I'm going to give myself a hard 6 to 8 reps versus a hard 30 reps. Right. It's night and day. So that would be one of the really cool applications of BFR for bodybuilders that have any aches and pains. Now, what would you do in terms of prescription? Well, number one, these are things that you would play around with if you don't want it to really impact your high intensity exercise prescription. Then you really need to get close to volitional failure, but not reach it. Because as soon as you reach it, then you're basically, those motor units are going to be done for the short term, right? So you really want to do higher pressure, but keep it in such that you have some RIR, whatever that prescription is. Me personally, I am trying to simplify the complexity and simplify the noise. We did publish on muscle growth and different repetition ranges. And the traditional repetition ranges are 30, 15, 15, 15. So 4 sets, 30 repetitions, followed by 3 sets of 15. There was also 3 to 4 sets of 15 and volitional failure. And we understand that the more volume you do, the more exercise-induced discomfort, etc. And what we did was we just compared the different rep ranges to whatever they were comparing, the comparator was with high load exercise. And what we found was it doesn't really matter what repetition range you're using, like 3 to 4 sets of 15 or multiple sets of failure or the 30, 15, 15, 15 repetition range. The muscle growth that was at least detected was similar. Now, remember, caveats, right? Like, just because something in a short-term study says that they're equal doesn't necessarily mean that over time the divergence is going to go like this. But what that tells us as practitioners and those that are enthusiastic about use of BFR is we can probably use slightly less reps and get the same benefit as long as loads are within 20 to 30% of the 1 rep max. That's important. A lot of times practically people come into my, practice, and we don't actually do a 10 RM test. We just start out with a light load that they can complete, and then we progress load over time. In the example that I was talking about with the pain, I actually want them to be very high pressure, 80% of the limb occlusion pressure if you're using a Western-based device, which just means that if, for example, and a lot of the technology that's out there now allows you to do this without thinking about it, like it's already built in to the device. But what they do is they basically take your blood pressure with that particular cuff, and whatever that value is, 80% of that is what I would use for your exercise. If you're using lower body, if you're using upper body, anywhere from 40 to 50, sometimes 60%, if tolerated, could be really good. And then 4 to 5 sets of 15 reps, 30 seconds of rest in between, and just making sure you're not hitting volitional failure. And then we can get that increase in endogenous opioids and that downregulation of pain, and then go hit your high intensity exercise, right? So we don't want, if our pursuit is maximal muscle growth, we do not want to use any sort of pre-intervention, or however you want to think about it, that might blunt motor unit recruitment for the, for the rest of your session, right? So if you're using BFR, then it doesn't matter. Like using BFR only, like you were doing, then yeah, I want to be able to get the stimulation and move on. Do I think we need a ton of sets to be able to do that? I don't know, because if you're doing 2 to 3 sets to failure, right, that's 2 to 3 actual like muscle building sets. But if you're using it in prep to lift heavier, then I would stay away from failure and have that high pressure be something that, hey, if you're like, I can only do a 3 RIR with 12 instead of 15 reps, it's 12 reps. Okay, cool. You're staying away from those last couple reps that are really going to, not do the damage, or, however, blunting that top end motor unit recruitment.
Really well explained. And I was lucky enough to get Saga Fitness, if you've heard of them. They gifted me some cuffs, so I was able to use that. And so kind of taking the thought out of the pressure needed was really great. If someone doesn't have access to those, maybe they're just going on Amazon for like some cheap ones where they're pulling it, and maybe they've got a scale of whatever's on there. Or I know when I first did BFR, they talked about like a 7 out of 10 of like tightness. Is that something that you can, like, do you recommend that? Do you think that's useful? Is that something you would recommend at all?
It's funny you're talking about this, because I'm going to be on a panel next month at Combined Sections meeting, which is the biggest physical therapy meeting, and that's actually part of our panelist discussion, like the question one, which is like, what does like risk assessment look like in blood flow restriction? And I think you need to separate clinical use from practical bodybuilder type use, right? Where in the clinic, we're dealing with individuals that have multiple, potentially multiple comorbidities following surgery, things like that. So in terms of the application of the pressure, I am a fan of more rather than less precision. So in that case, I really want pneumatic devices that are able to determine the amount of pressure applied, or I want pneumatic devices that do not occlude, right? And that might sacrifice a little bit of the efficacy, but it's something that will allow for safe administration of BFR. When we're thinking about the bodybuilding community, people are going to do whatever they're going to do anyways, right? So like BFR in and of itself is a relatively safe, modality of exercise that you can use. Now, if I will say that just doing a 6 or 7 out of 10 tightness, listen, it's not my favorite because it's not really objective. We do have evidence that shows, again, from Dr. Lenneke's lab, he's the GOAT, that if you take a pneumatic device and you have individuals over the course of a couple of days inflate to what they perceive as a 6 or 7 out of 10 tightness, that over or underestimates the applied pressure by 20 to 25% in the upper and lower body. So there's a lot of variability in in that pressure scale system. So typically what I recommend is very, very simple. I would just make sure that you're not super occlusive. So all that means is you might need to invest in a $25 pulse ox, right? Where you're just putting it on your limb, you're tightening up that sleeve, and you're just making sure that blood flow is still going to the limb, right? How do you know if that's the case? Well, if the pulse ox registers your O2 saturation and your heart rate, you know you're still getting blood flow. If it's not, then I would loosen it up, right? That's typically what I would begrudgingly recommend, because the cost of all these cuffs are coming down, even like relative to 2 years ago. We're getting more and more, as BFR is growing, more and more companies are entering the marketplace, and the cost to the consumer is going down. And for me, it's like, okay, if I'm going to be using something that is going to manipulate my blood flow, I personally would be more rather than less precise. That's not the same risk tolerance as other people. So at least having some common sense guidelines to be able to do that is important. There should be no numbness and tingling associated with the application, either in the arms or the legs. And certainly if your arm is turning purple, you're probably supra occlusive. And again, Do I think that that's an absolute danger? Like being super occlusive, do I think that that's a danger? Not really, but we can't underestimate the potential for a large scale population use to then discover problems that we might not see in a controlled trial, which is why we should always err on the side of caution rather than aggressiveness. Plus, the fact that we understand that as long as you're operating close to volitional failure, regardless of the amount of applied pressure that you're using, the results are going to be the same. So why would you go more rather than less pressure? If you operate under that paradigm, which is what I do. You teach a paradigm and then everything else kind of fits in as long as you adopt that, that mindset.
So well explained. I was going to say, it sounds like if you haven't got one of the pneumatic devices, which sound like the way to go, much safer, more efficacious, more standardized for all those reasons. Sorry, go for it.
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had a point. Okay, quote unquote, Rabbit is safer, and then go that route. But if you, I don't know, can't afford it, don't want the budget to go that way, if you are using just one of the cheaper bands you can get online or knee wraps or something, go a bit less tight, and then you can be sure that as long as you take those reps close or to failure, like, hey, you're getting an effective workout. As long as you go heavy enough, which if you're below certainly below 20 reps, you're doing all right with that. And that's kind of what I ended up applying to some of mine, where I didn't follow the traditional 30, 15, 15, 15. I kind of just took every set like I did the first set, it was a bit higher reps, and it wasn't as high as 30. I went like 15, and then I just let the reps drop off and auto-regulated based off my basically proximity to failure. And yeah, they were pretty horrendous. The rest, like between sets, is like some of the most uncomfortable between them. And it's actually a question I had for you. Would you say in that scenario, where say your proximity to failure is like for like 4 traditional straight sets without the occlusion versus 4 kind of with it and the short rest periods, would you say that's like 4 matched hard sets, or would you say maybe those ones that are under fatigue, kind of similar to like drop sets or things like this, they don't quite get you equivalent hypertrophy set for set, if that makes sense?
If the proximity to muscle failure is identical, they're identical, in my opinion.
Okay.
Now, remember what we said in the beginning, which is there's probably going to be a point in time where if you're consistently using BFR versus consistently using high load exercise, that there's going to be a divergence. Whether that matters practically or is just mental masturbation is another thing. But for me, we know that there's simultaneous motor unit recruitment and high load exercise, and there's cycling of the motor units in low load with or without blood flow restriction. And so we know that there's going to be differences in terms of the absolute level of recruitment, because as fatigue sets in, maybe some of those motor units actually, don't really get as much of a stimulus as they would if they were, you were lifting under another condition. And so I think that honestly, it goes back to the same paradigm. Just because you're adding blood flow restriction doesn't change the fundamentals of exercise science and how you respond to a hard set. It's just going to be whether or not you're going to have more discomfort, relatively speaking, or less discomfort. As long as your proximity to failure is similar, you're there. And I think that that's kind of where some of the skill comes into play, because as you mentioned earlier, it's like that metabolic stress, you're using a really light load, relatively speaking, right? So, it's different in being able to prognosticate your proximity to failure when you're using 80% of your 1 rep max, right? Because you're like, I got this. And, you always reach that point where you're just like, you're lowering it down, you're lowering the weight down, and you're like, do I have it? Do I have another rep? Do I have another rep? Okay. And then you make that decision. With BFR, because there's such a cognitive, there's this afferent feedback that's coming in from the sensors, the group 3, group 4 afferents that are creating this increased cognitive demand. You may have more reps in the tank than you actually, might not otherwise think, because the noise is greater.
Yeah.
Basically. So that's where, again, it comes down to, like, BFR is a great tool, but you have to understand its limitations when you're thinking about implementing it for a long period of time. And by
Yeah.
long, I mean more than, 4 to 8 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. Yeah, I don't think anyone would want to use it for longer than that if they can help it. And it doesn't sound like that's the appropriate use for, which is what it is, essentially a tool. And a lot of the benefits and downsides sound like high reps, but to the extreme, really, in that it allows you to use like those really light loads, less joint and connective tissue pain. But similarly with high reps, they're a bit more uncomfortable, shown in the research, than lower reps, and proximity to failure is harder to judge. And it's even more like to the extreme with BFR in a sense. And the kind of practical uses you mentioned, I think, were great in regards to, hey, maybe when you're like an injury crops up, you go a bit tighter, you take those sets as like they're your sets and that's all you're doing. And then you can back it off, use it as that kind of therapeutic kind of warm up as a sense, then get into your heavy loading. And then hopefully at some point you remove it completely. The only other comment, I think probably the way you intend it to be used in a deload is similar to like that warm up effect. Only reason I comment on that is I think it was 2017. You'll laugh at this as a competitor. In my peak week for bodybuilding, I was like, I read some research where BFR didn't cause as much muscle damage, or doesn't cause muscle damage, and so I was like, like that seems like a really smart move for like getting blood flow and nutrients partitioned during my peak week. And I did blood flow restriction training. I can't tell you how sore I was being unaccustomed to it, and yeah, being on stage with sore, I don't know, it was sore quads basically. Wasn't much fun.
And that, by the way, is my biggest concern on blood flow restriction. Paradoxically, is that the whole crowd of exercise science, when you go on Instagram, they're like, oh, like now actually it's a little bit different. But even like 3 or 4 years ago, going on and you're saying muscle tears, for muscle damage. And what we're understanding about muscle damage is it's really, calcium ion related, and the cell's ability to buffer calcium, to sequester it and bring it back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, getting it into the mitochondria, things like that. And when you're novel to BFR, even if you have high intensity, training history, there's still a small risk that you're going to create, especially if you're training really, really hard. You're going to create a situation where you could have high levels of muscle damage, just because the sodium potassium ATPase pumps, the circa, all of those other, small nerdy things inside of the muscle that help mitigate the impact of fatigue, or at least trying to mitigate the onset of fatigue, those are not really upregulated to the same capacity. So the biggest thing that I always recommend is 1 to 2, maybe 3 sessions of a modified BFR program, and then go ham. You can go to failure every time. Sure, you might have a little bit more, the research does show that there is a stronger likelihood that you'll be able to recover really quickly. But we do have evidence to show that, yeah, if you're going to failure very frequently in a high frequency program, it can delay the super compensation phase like 23, 25, 27 days. Like Thomas Bjornson's research, they kind of done high frequency, and they looked at that long delayed response. So when you're looking at trying to say, oh, I want to use BFR and I want to use it very frequently, I think you could, But you need to use it in such a way that you're not really, always going to volitional failure, because I do think that the recovery period is much quicker. Why? Certainly compared to low load exercise, because the longer you do an activity, the more calcium ion is going to accumulate. Like with low load exercise, you're repeating, and that's a longer chance that you're going to, basically activate all these calcium ion related mechanisms that are going to damage the cell. So you can avoid that by using BFR, acclimating, and then making sure that not every set that you're going to do is going to volitional failure. And then you possibly can train a little bit more frequently than you would with high load exercise. Although that is kind of one of I have many different, ideas and studies that I think would be extremely helpful in understanding where BFR can fit in a programming perspective. And one of them, we really don't have a lot of evidence to look at and say, all right, I want somebody to do for 2 weeks. I want somebody to do BFR twice a day. And I want to compare it to the same person doing high load exercise 1 to 2 times per day. Is there going to be a difference in muscle growth after that 2 weeks? We tend to see pretty unanimously, actually, it's not even tend to see, it is, that with the high frequency research that's greater than 5 sets of 5 sessions per week, that BFR outperforms low intensity exercise. But we really don't have an idea, a firm grasp of what happens with high load exercise. Brad actually was involved in one of the studies that looked at basically doing a more BFR for a higher frequency in the beginning of a program, and then tracked the amount of muscle growth over time and compared to high load exercise. And basically what they found was that BFR outperforms high load exercise initially, but in a longer training program, high load exercise outperforms BFR. And that's really what I would expect if everything I just talked about was more true than not. And I don't want to subscribe to a lot of things in an absolutist perspective, but that's kind of how I kind of feel its place in a training program would be with BFR.
So well said, Nick. And this has been, I think, a masterclass for bodybuilders who have heard of BFR and maybe even used it, but now actually have the practical sense of how to use it, get the most from it. I think that mentioning that kind of gradual acclimation period, even a couple of sessions, will go a long way for a lot of people. Like anything novel, this is particularly novel. That'll help people get the most from it. So I want to say a massive thank you for you taking the time to kind of outline all of that for the listeners. If people want to keep up to date with yourself, the work you're doing, where should they be looking?
This is going to be time for a shameless plug. Sport Grips. This is
Other
my
projects,
company.
yes.
This is the best forearm strengthening device on the market. Basically, it gives a lot of resistance. You can do flexion and extension, so you don't skip the grip. I think a lot of people, maybe not bodybuilders, but a lot of people in general don't train their grip. And this is just one of those tools that addresses a very, important need. So I am the CEO of that company. That's Sport Grips. If anybody's listening and they want to snag the device, it's a premium device. It's not cheap. But it's American made, everything. They can use the HPM, which is actually my Instagram account, if they want to follow me. And if they want more BFR specific info, then they can follow the BFR pros on Instagram. And that's kind of where I dump a lot of the research that I come across. And so you can just scroll and you can get a ton of information there. And then I offer training classes, both online at BFR Training or Blood Flow Restriction. I own that domain, bloodflowrestriction.com, or in person if you're a clinician through our education wing. But I really thank you for the opportunity to get on here and talk about building some muscle, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Of course. Yeah, I think on your course, actually, because I was looking over as I was doing my research, I saw the House of Hypertrophy, who I've heard many videos of because he's getting quite prolific on YouTube and does a great job from everything I've seen. He really rated your course. So that was, I don't know, it was just cool to see. I had no idea what he even looked like. I've only ever heard his voice.
Yeah, no, for sure. We did a couple of partnership posts back like 3 years ago or whatever, and great guy. And yeah, love his content.
Is he from
So,
the UK? He sounded.
yep,
I thought he sounded. I was like, I thought he was British, but
yep,
yeah, he keeps himself to just like the graphics and things, which is
yep.
cool. And with your grip device, what is the main population that end up going for that? Do you know who's it mostly marketed towards? Is there any
I
specifics?
mean, we're in the stage of marketing more to fitness. We have actually 4 different products. We took this company over from a solopreneur and really are trying to scale it and make it even better. And so yeah, I mean, listen, this is one of those products. You pick it up, you use it, you're like, wow, stuff it in your gym bag. Our protocol, because people skip the grip, literally, like my wife, she does brand strategy, and she has these advanced listening tools, and so she scoured the interwebs as we were kind of launching, and basically the whole idea of grip training is people don't do it. They complain that their grip is a limiter, but then they don't train their grip. So that's where we came up with don't skip the grip. So anybody really that's interested in improving their grip, both flexion extension, but also pronation and supination, could check this out. I really do. I mean, I stand behind it. Like it is. I mean, my forearms are, are
I was going to
pretty
say
sizable.
hypertrophy too.
Yeah. Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, again, the forearms are probably, more endurance based in general, just based on what their functional demands are. But I refuse to believe that they can't grow. I just refuse. Just like, for example, we knew about that the calves were a problem area. And now everyone is saying, oh, okay, it's actually because the calves are actually more engaged in the lengthened position. And so if we accommodate for the Achilles tendon, which is very elastic, then we can shift the demand to more active tension and thus grow the calves. The forearms are a lot more complex because there's a lot more muscles involved, but my clients have seen growth using it twice a week. And I have executives that basically they're on a call like this, and then underneath the table, they're working on their grip. It's very
Love it.
portable, and very fortunate that, I'm involved in this. I really do think that it can help a lot of people in their training. And it's American made. So in kind of today, that's important for people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it sounds like a really cool device, and I have a number of clients training their forearms, and I've trained them before, and it just ends up always being awkward. Whereas actually, that device looks very kind of orthopedically friendly, if I can put it in those terms.
Yeah, we'll get you one, and then you can test it out.
I have the biggest forearms.
It's you'll get the idea when you pick it up. But
yeah,
because people skip the grip, the protocol that I use is very simple. At the end of your workout, you're going to twist the resistance to whatever you're going to be at, right? That's your resistance. And then you're going to go 20 seconds as hard as you can, flexion, extension, whatever, or pronation, supination. Rest 40 seconds, repeat that 2 more times. The whole protocol is 2 minutes and 20 seconds, and you are absolutely smoked. Your whole forearm is smoked. So easy.
it sounds really good, actually. I was just thinking the best forearm pump I actually remember having was wall climbing. Because
You'll I'm training right now just for extended hangs, and I'm using blood flow restriction as well to maximize the hypoxic environment, so I can improve the vascularity in my finger flexors. And let me tell you, it's the pump for using the Revolution 2.0 is comparable. I think not as painful on the distal interphalangeal joints, the these guys, but definitely, you know, the forearm itself, it's
Awesome.
definitely comparable.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you, Nick. I'm glad we discussed that product a little bit, because I think actually there'll be a number of listeners interested in that. I'll make sure it's linked in the description, along with, did you mention a code for people to use?
You can use
your
the
Instagram handle
HPM for $15 off.
Cool.
And yeah, it's definitely check it out and tag us, Sport Grips, the HPM on Instagram. If you're using BFR, definitely do that. I would love to hear
cool.
how people are implementing blood flow restriction in their own training. And yeah, again, thank you
Amazing.
for allowing me to be a guest.
For sure. Yeah, I'll make sure that's all linked in the description for everyone to check out. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Nick, again, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.